Hello and welcome to Newswire. I am Jawad Tehami. Despite the historic peace deal between the US and the Taliban, tensions have risen again in Afghanistan as the US and the Taliban have blamed each other of not fulfilling their obligations according to the deal. In a rare Twitter spat, US spokesperson for Afghanistan, Colonel Sonny Leggett, warned the Taliban of response if the violence is not reduced. However, Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid blamed the US of harming the current environment by pointless and provocative statements. This comes after increased fighting and violence in the war-torn country. However, more prisoners have been released by both the sides, but the number remains low as compared to what was mentioned in the Doha peace deal. And to talk more about this, we are joined today at News by Dr. Jonathan Schroden, who is Director and Special Operations Program at CAN from Washington, D.C., and Lieutenant General Ghulam Mustafa, Analyst, joining us from Lahore. Thank you, both of you, for your time at Newswire. I'll start the discussion with you, Dr. Schroden. When it comes to the obligations of the U.S. Under the Doha peace deal, which has been alluded by the Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid as well, what are those obligations that the U.S. has to fulfill under the Doha peace deal?
You know, the Taliban are most upset about the prisoner exchange aspect of the U.S.-Taliban deal right now, which called for the release of up to 5,000 Taliban prisoners in exchange for about 1,500 Afghan government prisoners that the Taliban have been holding. The U.S., though, finds itself in a difficult position because the agreement that the U.S. signed with Afghanistan's government only said that only required the Afghan government to work toward the release of some prisoners. It didn't include the exact same language. And so while some pointed to the differences in those clauses as providing some amount of diplomatic maneuver space, and the net result that we've seen over the last month and a half, 2 months, is that it's really slowed the movement towards the start of intra-Afghan negotiations because the two sides can't agree on how many prisoners to be released, which specific prisoners to be released, and the pace at which those prisoners are to be released. And so the two sides are continuing to slowly make progress on that issue, but it has proven to be much more sticky getting through that. That was meant to be a very quick confidence-building measure between the two sides, and it's taken much, much longer to implement than I think anyone thought it would.
So do you think the Taliban are justified in continuing with their violence until the number which is mentioned in the Doha peace deal, that is 5,000 prisoners from the Taliban side to be released by the Afghan government? What do you have to say about it? I mean, when it comes to the implementation of the deal, the first and the foremost step was this prisoner release. And until that doesn't happen in full, the Taliban say they would continue with their violence.
Yeah, so it's the overt language of the U.S.-Taliban deal, which is to say that the public version that everyone has access to, doesn't say anything about a ceasefire or even a reduction in violence as a condition of the agreement for either side. There is supposedly some secret annexes to the deal. There have been numerous officials who have commented publicly on some of what that might contain, and it appears that one of those mentions the fact that the Taliban agreed to not attack U.S. forces, to not attack inside the cities, major roads, those types of things. The Taliban have maintained that they've upheld their end of that, part of the secret annex in not attacking in those ways. They have focused their attacks on checkpoints in rural areas, on Afghan security force bases and checkpoints in those areas, et cetera. And so their contention is that while they've ramped up the level of violence overall, the targets of their violence have been legitimate under the terms of the secret annex. The U.S. has disputed that. As you said, the U.S. Forces Afghanistan spokesman in his tweets said that the U.S. and the Taliban had some sort of, in his words, verbal understanding that a reduction in violence would accompany the agreement, and that they're disappointed that the Taliban have chosen to ramp the level of violence back up. But again, there's no public agreement to that effect, and it seems questionable whether or not the secret annex actually included the type of language that the U.S. 4A spokesman is saying that they had verbally agreed to.
Okay, General Mustafa, talking about Sony Leggett's tweet which I quote, attacks generate attacks while restraint produces restraint. If the violence cannot be reduced, then yes, there will be responses. And there was a strong reaction of the Taliban spokesperson, Zabiullah Mujahid, on this particular tweet as well. According to you, what are the main irritants? As we know that the prisoner release, which is the first and the foremost condition for the inter-Afghan talks as per the Doha peace deal, is very slow.
Actually, the main irritant is the agreement itself. If you look at it, the major flaws are, number one, who is the guarantor in case Taliban fail to uphold their side of the agreement, or on the other side, the U.S. decides not to follow on the agreement. Who is going to ensure that? Number one, that is the guarantor is missing. Number two, when the language is as vague as reduction in violence, what does actually that imply? As far as the public documents are concerned, or even whatever little one has come to know of the secret agreements that has taken place between the two sides, one is not sure what actually is meant by the reduction in violence. So Taliban have their way of interpreting the whole thing, and for them, release of prisoners is foremost because there's some quite important people are held by the Afghan government. On the other side, the Afghan government as it is, they initially were feeling left out. And even now I feel their cribs are justified to the extent that where would, for example, the current dispensation go? How would they be accommodated? What kind of balance would be in their favor? So it's pretty vague as it is, the agreement to start with. And to bring it down to the brass tacks and get it implemented, there is no guarantor who can force either side. Taliban, on the other hand, are playing a game as safe as they've been doing it earlier because time they feel is on their side, and they feel that the hurry should be, if there is any speed or any time limit imposed, is by the U.S. themselves. So therefore, I think it's going to prolong a bit. And to start with, I think I was not, for example, I was not very sure whether we'll follow through with this agreement or whether we'll get to that point where the inter-Afghan dialogues take place. And if and when that happens, who is again going to oversee the success or failure, or how do we, the mechanism, how do we come about getting to that moment when the foreign forces leave Afghanistan, when Taliban feel satisfied, when the Afghans themselves feel satisfied. I think it's a pretty uphill task as it is now.
So, General Mustafa, when you speak of a particular agreement between the US and the Taliban of being vague, and the language which is there in the agreement is not clear enough as well, and that is actually causing the trouble in the implementation of this particular peace deal. So what exactly does this depict? After lengthy rounds of negotiations between the two sides, didn't the US beforehand think over all these particular things which would be coming up after the signing of the peace deal?
I think both sides knew that this is likely to happen because you expect that the sides as smart as Taliban or on the other hand, US, who have been in the negotiations sometimes behind the scenes for a long time, would not be very clear about it. I think the US has self-imposed a restriction of some kind of a time limit. Probably they were thinking of the upcoming US elections. Therefore, for them to get an agreement to the American public's benefit or to satisfy their curiosity or whatever the American public is coming up with, I think the agreement is important. Taliban know that the Americans have to leave, and Taliban also know the time is on their side. So they can prolong it as long as they want to, because they have been in this game for a very long time. Another couple of years won't matter to them. Whereas the US has this compulsion of either getting out before the elections or giving something very solid to their own public just about the time when the election campaign gets into play in earnest.
Okay, Dr. Schroden, there had been some airstrikes as well by the US on Taliban as well. Do you think that the US is serious in withdrawing its troops as per the timeline which is mentioned in the Doha peace deal?
Well, certainly the initial drawdown has already been underway. The deal calls for the U.S. to draw down its forces to about 8,600 troops or so, which is roughly the level that President Trump inherited when he came into office. It's been reported that they're actually slightly ahead of schedule in terms of withdrawing those troops and getting to that number. They had aimed to do that by about June or July, and it looks like they'll meet that target number slightly ahead of that schedule. So they are drawing down to that level. Although it's worth noting that drawdown had been announced as likely to take place even before the U.S.-Taliban agreement was signed. So that was probably going to happen anyway. When you look at the remainder of the drawdown, the rest of those 8,600 troops, the deal calls for that to happen within about 14 months, which would be roughly May timeframe of next year. But the U.S. officials that have commented on this publicly have said that is not a guaranteed timeline, that if the Taliban don't adhere to the letter of the deal, but also to the U.S.'s expectations, which I think, quite publicly they've made clear include some form of reduction in violence, that they'll delay the troop drawdown. And while I take General Mustafa's point about the election this fall, and I wouldn't discount the potential impact of that. Certainly, the reporting from D.C. press is that President Trump is, frustrated with the pace of the Afghan peace talks and sort of the situation there, and rightfully so. But I would just point out that, the U.S. first announced its intention to draw down and get out of Afghanistan about 8 years ago, and yet we're still there. And so this idea that the Taliban have all the time in the world and the U.S. is eager to rush for the exits, while that sentiment might be generally true, the foreign policy establishment in the U.S. has managed to sort of keep that desire somewhat in check relative to U.S. national interests. And so I wouldn't put too much stock in the idea that the U.S. wants to just up and pull out before the November election, or that will somehow be an accelerant. I think the U.S. will continue to put its national interests first and make its calculations about whether or not to continue withdrawing troops in accordance with those national interests.
So, Dr. Schroden, you mentioned that the troops withdrawal as of today is much faster what it was supposed to be. And in a certain section of media, there are reports that now there are 10,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and ideally there should have been around 12 to 13,000 troops within Afghanistan. Do you think this fast troop withdrawal owes because of the sincerity of the U.S. administration regarding this withdrawal, or does it have to do with the COVID-19 pandemic threat?
Yeah, I would attribute it to sort of three things. I mean, one, to demonstrate the seriousness on the U.S. side, as you suggest. Certainly the COVID threat doesn't help in terms of how the U.S. feels about having troops in the region, and there's been some media reporting to indicate that President Trump is worried about that, as well he should be. But I think there's a third element that I would point to as well, which is anytime you're going to make major adjustments in troop levels of this kind, it's generally better from an operational standpoint to get to that new level as quickly as you can, so that you can figure out how you're going to operate at that new level of troops. And so, it doesn't make as much sense from an operational standpoint to prolong the change period. Ideally, you want to get through that as quickly as possible so that you can establish some new sense of operational normality at whatever the new level of troops will be.
Okay, General Mustafa, when we talk about the prisoner release, and you also mentioned in your comments that there are certain specific prisoners of the Taliban which they are actually focusing that they want them to be released at the earliest, 15 of them to be specific. And on the other side, the Afghan government says that those 15 were behind the deadly attacks that killed nearly 150 civilians in Kabul. Who those specific prisoners are and why the Taliban are so much interested in getting them released before?
Frankly, I don't remember the names of all those 15 prisoners, but the fact is that the Taliban have their own benchmarks with regard to the agreement and with regard to the release of the prisoners. And they have intentionally pointed out those number 15 prisoners that you're talking about, because the Afghan government feels very strongly about them. And that is a point that the Taliban would be using as a stick to beat the Afghan government with. And whenever there is a talk between the Taliban representatives and the Americans, that this is what the Taliban wanted, why is it that the Afghan government is not releasing those 15 prisoners? So creating a sticking point in the negotiations and in furtherance of their own objective is how the Taliban have always operated. And that is how it's going to be. And as regards the doctor's comment, I agree with him that America is not about to just up and pull out of Afghanistan so quickly. It's not likely to happen unless COVID-19 gets the American economy down to that level. But otherwise, having spent so much time, money, and effort in Afghanistan for all those years, there is a purpose behind that. And that purpose is not yet been achieved by the Americans. And on the other hand, you have to also look at the ring countries around it, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China. How are they looking at the whole situation evolving? And for them to be a part of this deal is also critical.
Okay, Mustafa, you just took the role of Pakistan as well, and the kind of impact Pakistan or the other surrounding countries around Afghanistan has because of the stability or the violence which goes on in that war-torn country. Yesterday, a statement came from Pakistan's Foreign Office that Pakistan has consistently underlined the importance of a peaceful and stable Afghanistan, which we deem indispensable for peace and stability in the region and beyond. So how do you see this statement from Pakistan?
Pakistan has made it very more than once. And all of us who have been discussing the Afghan peace process, in fact, almost everyone in Pakistan is of the view that Afghanistan has to settle in one way or the other. And it has to be a peaceful Afghanistan, which is critical for Pakistan's peace because we are somehow linked geographically and otherwise. We are a region. You should be seen as such geographical region. And therefore, peace in one region is directly linked to the peace in the other region. But beyond that, there is a situation of the economic connectivity which is evolving. That is how the Chinese government had come in Afghanistan in a big way. And they were hoping that things settle down in Afghanistan and some kind of agreement takes place between the Taliban and the other players. And those players, I have always been insisting that like Afghanistan, the Iran, Pakistan is part of it already. But Americans creating this rift with Iran actually is making their own task difficult in Afghanistan. So Iran, China and Russia, if they're also brought on board and some or the other this peace process is actually to be ensured by these people who are in part of this game plan in this region, that is when I think we'll start seeing a settle of Afghanistan. It's critical for the peace of the region. It's critical for the evolution of the economic connectivity, which was being envisaged by not only by China but Iran and Russia, also the other countries in the region, and was reaching as far off as Europe. So therefore, I think it's now paramount that these players, main players that I've talked about, they've also brought on board, and they actually sit down with Taliban and the Afghan government to bring it to a level where this connectivity can progress for the benefit of everybody in the region.
Okay, Dr. Schroden, when we talk about National Security Council spokesperson Jawad Tehami, who said that inmates were freed a couple of days before 98 more Taliban prisoners were released, and he's of the view that they were released based on their age, health, and the remaining sentence. Is this the deliberate thing to tease the Taliban because such type of precondition was not mentioned in the Doha peace deal? Wouldn't we consider it a discrimination?
Well, I think I would suggest that the Afghan government has probably made those calculations based more on the degree of leverage that it believes it will lose in talks with the Taliban relative to the prisoners that it's releasing, which is to say, coming back to your earlier question about the 15 Taliban commanders that they asked to be released and the Afghan government's refusal to do so, the release of all these prisoners, the Afghan government, I think quite rightly, views that as a reduction in its leverage for intra-Afghan negotiations if and when they actually start. And so if it were to release the prisoners the Taliban desires the most, at the outset of this sort of confidence building measure, then their view is they would lose a bunch of leverage in those talks. So I think they're releasing individuals that, yes, they might be old, they might be sick, but those are probably in their eyes without being too frank about it, the least valuable of the prisoners that they hold relative to what they see as a relatively weak negotiating position with the Taliban.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jonathan Schroden, Director, Special Operations Program at CAN from Washington, D.C., for being with us at Newswire, and Lieutenant General retired Ghulam Mustafa, Analyst, joining us from Lahore. With this, we come to the end of the first segment of the show. In the second, we will discuss the political crisis in Israel as the Supreme Court of the country hears petition against the emergency government agreement and Prime Minister Netanyahu. For that, stay tuned. We'll be right back in a bit. Welcome back to Newswire. In Israel, after weeks of tense negotiations, the political standoff between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his rival Benny Gantz came to an end. Citing COVID-19 threat and collective response to it, both agreed to form a unity government. The deal gave a breather to Netanyahu, whose political career was at stake owing to his indictment under 3 criminal charges, the trial of which is to commence on 24th of May. However, the country's Supreme Court has begun hearing a petition against Netanyahu in the premier's role. The top court will also decide about the legality of the agreement signed between Netanyahu and Gantz. This came after thousands of people in Tel Aviv demonstrated against Netanyahu. Now, the question arises, did Netanyahu use the crisis situation to his own advantage? Will the Supreme Court nullify the deal to form a unity government? And will Israel go into 4th consecutive election in just over a year? And why are the people protesting in Israel? To talk more about this, we are joined by Mr. Bar Yoshafat, an attorney and a political commentator joining us from Jerusalem. Thank you very much for your time. I'll begin with this particular thing. Who are the petitioners in the Supreme Court against this particular deal which has been signed between Netanyahu and Gantz?
Thank you for having me on your show. The people who are petitioning against Netanyahu, you have his political opponents, the Yesh Atid party. You have a non-for-profit in Israel which is called the Movement for Quality Government. And you have a lot of individuals, 120 people from the high-tech industry and other private attorneys.
Okay, as a student of law myself, I'm curious what the Israeli law says about a certain position holder, just like the premier himself, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. If he has been indicted under the criminal offenses, can he carry on with the position? Can he hold on to the position until or during that particular time of the trial?
So Israel, like most Western countries, has the following law. It says that you're allowed to serve as prime minister until you have a final verdict. And why is that? Because you can have a situation where the political opponent will try to take down the prime minister just by accusing that person of a crime. So the Israeli legislator, like again many Western countries, have thought about that scenario. So they said, again, you can serve until there's a final verdict. The question in Israel that is very interesting is the Supreme Court allowed to right now basically have his ruling that, in response to the agreement between the Likud party and the Blue and White party? Because the law says very specifically that Netanyahu can continue to serve. So there's a question, what is the legality of the debate itself?
Okay, as per Israeli law that you, as per the international legal norms as well, unless convicted by a court of law in a fair and impartial trial, the person can continue. But when we talk about the democracy and the democratic norms, has there been any precedence that a person who has been indicted under criminal charges, he has to wait for that final verdict from the court of law and can relinquish his position for that specific time period of trial?
So the Israeli law actually talks about that specifically. They're talking about a situation where someone is indicted, but you have to wait for the final verdict, because otherwise Because Israel is a parliamentary system, meaning our head of state is the prime minister, if you're taking down the prime minister, basically you took down the government. So in order to prevent situations where an opposition or anyone who just doesn't like that specific prime minister will use that power of accusing someone of being guilty of a crime, you have to wait for a final verdict. If there is a final verdict and someone is found guilty of a crime, obviously they cannot serve. But there's a trial that needs to take place, and after that you can appeal and ask for other legal questions that may arise in that trial. So it's a very, very long process. The main debate in Israel is why is the Supreme Court even discussing this case? Because basically we had 3 elections in the past year, and in this agreement between the Likud and Blue and White, basically it's a very large representation of the Israeli public. Now, I want to say one more thing. Politically, it's very interesting that the right-wing bloc, and in that I will include Netanyahu, would actually be very happy if the Israeli Supreme Court will say that he cannot form a government, because that means a 4th election, and the right-wing bloc is most likely to grow. I believe that the Supreme Court also knows that, which is why I assume the Supreme Court will say, because of the circumstances of the COVID-19 that the whole world is facing and the fact that we have not had a government for the past year, we're not going to interfere in these agreements between Likud and Blue and White.
Okay, so of the view that it is the likelihood that the Supreme Court is not going to give a ruling against Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as the deal which he has signed with Benny Gantz. So when we talk about the particular point, Benjamin Netanyahu was being criticized by the opponents that he wants to have more influence on the committee to appoint the judges. When it comes to this particular point, don't you think the judiciary would become more conscious about this particular thing?
That's a very good question. I think that the problem in the checks and balances in Israel is actually the opposite. I would argue that the Supreme Court, our judicial branch, is interfering in our executive branch and our legislative branch. The case in Israel is that there's a committee that elects judges, and basically the judges have an automatic veto, which means they pretty much nominate themselves. And I think it's very odd. You have different legal systems where politicians choose the judges. You have different systems where you have judges that can come from the academia. In Israel, it's a very closed system right now that gives most of the power to the Supreme Court. What Netanyahu is suggesting is not really a new concept. Again, because Israel is a parliamentary system, then you have people in the committee that choose the judges from the coalition and from the opposition. But sometimes you can have people who are in the opposition but are very much aligned with the coalition's point of view regarding the judicial activism in Israel. We've had this case over and over in the past decade, so it's not that unique. And I have to say, again, the concept, the question of the amount of interference that the judicial branch has in Israel, you can find people who are considered to be left-wing leaning in Israel and are still very worried about the interference of the Israeli Supreme Court in the executive branch and the legislative branch.
So, Mr. Bar Yoshafat, one last question. Why are the people protesting in Tel Aviv against this particular deal between Gantz and Netanyahu?
Well, I can definitely understand them. They've been waiting for the past year for someone who will replace Netanyahu, and at the last second, the party, which was called Blue and White, which basically didn't really have any ideology apart from opposing Netanyahu, they collapsed, they dismantled. So people are feeling ripped off, and they're saying, we voted for a person who's eventually going to join Netanyahu. I'm very happy that they're allowed to protest. I think it's great for them to express their frustration, and it's very good that they do this in a non-violent way. But legally, there is no case here. If they're not happy with the results, next elections, they should vote differently.
Thank you very much for being at Newswire, Mr. Ron Bar Yoshafat, attorney and political commentator who joined us from Jerusalem. Now we are joined at Newswire by Professor Kamel, Hawaash analyst and commentator on Middle East affairs, joining us for Birmingham. Thank you very much for your time. Sir, what do you think? Did Netanyahu take the advantage of the crisis situation owing to COVID-19 in Israel to his own personal advantage?
Yes, I mean, Netanyahu is a political survivor, if you like. He has done everything in his power over the years to stay in power, the longest-serving Israeli prime minister. And these corruption charges have followed him for the last few years, and he's again using I think the COVID crisis to say to the Israeli public that there's a need for a government after three elections that failed to produce an outright winner, and that because of that they should agree to this agreement he has with his rival Gantz, who in his case has broken his own promises within his own party and with others in order to get this coalition together. So I think that the Israeli public is expressing its displeasure with this agreement, and it'll be very interesting to see how the court reacts in relation to the various cases that have been brought against the.
So, Professor Hawaash, keeping the particular two cases which the Supreme Court in Israel is hearing, what is the likelihood of the verdict? Would it go against Benjamin Netanyahu and that particular deal which he signed with Gantz, or could he be led by the Supreme Court to carry on with this particular deal and as the Prime Minister of the country?
It is very difficult to predict. I didn't hear what the speaker from Jerusalem said, but it is really very difficult to predict what's going to happen. I mean, we know what might happen is one of two things: either they uphold the cases that have come in other words, decide that the agreement is not valid, in which case, I mean, it will plunge Israel into another election, the fourth in the last year and a half or so, or they let him carry on, in which case he will have won. And it really is very difficult to predict, and I don't think I would make a prediction here.
Okay, Professor Hawaash, when we talk the previous election, the third election in which the Blue and White Party got majority of the seats and they were given the mandate to form the government, but they couldn't form it within that particular stipulated time frame. Now, when Israel, if goes into the fourth election, what are the chances for Benjamin Netanyahu, as we have seen that Blue and White Party has disintegrated into many other smaller parties?
That's right. I think that's the key difference this time. In the past three elections, Blue and White was seen as, if you like, a credible coalition of people. It wasn't just the Blue and White, that they could bring together a coalition. It was a question of whether they'd have enough seats to form a government. This time, Gantz has effectively put being in power almost ahead of even his own internal politics within his party. And of course, they have also ditched the Arab list, which had initially given its backing to him simply because they didn't want or some of them, to be accurate, they didn't want Netanyahu back in power. So that could move some voters away from Blue and White towards Netanyahu in a show of, if you like, objection to what Gantz did. Overall, it is unlikely, I think, that any single party is going to be that dominant that it would just form a government on its own. So we'll go back to the trading that happens after each Israeli election to form a government. But it could mean a return to, if you like, the right rather than a move towards the center, if we can call it that, which is still very right in Israel.
Okay, Professor, one very critical question as far as the annexation of the land of the Palestinian territories, especially of the West Bank, is concerned. As per the deal of the century that the U.S. calls it, the Middle East peace plan, and both of these leaders in Israel, Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu, are in favor of the annexation of those lands. And with the U.S. support, that is likely to commence on the 1st of July. But the UN and other agencies and the Palestinian people have said that this is against the international law. So what kind of an impact if this particular deal, which has been signed between Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu, it is not overturned by the Supreme Court, and they carry on with this particular deal, and Benjamin Netanyahu continuing as the Prime Minister, what would be the impact on this annexation and for the Palestinians in future?
I mean, first of all, I think that they have faced, the two, Gantz and Netanyahu, quite a lot of pushback from within Israel itself, but particularly from the international community. We've had, I believe, 11 ambassadors of EU countries tell them that what they would do would be illegal. Here in the UK, we had over 120 MPs sign a letter asking the government to take a firm position, indeed calling even for sanctions against Israel. And this is the first time that I've seen such a large number of MPs call for sanctions against Israel. But they all see that the impact of annexation will be, although a lot of us believe that the two-state solution is dead anyway, but they believe this would be the final nail in the coffin to that. And of course, the international community then wouldn't know what to do. If Israel says it rules over the whole land, but half the population is it allows to vote and to engage in politics, but the other half have no rights, people will immediately see it, which is what it is, as an apartheid state, and that would bring, I think, a backlash from the international community. So I think there's been pushback. However, I also think that Netanyahu is willing to take what he can get from Donald Trump while he is still president. And so I would not be surprised if he carried out, together with Gantz, a limited amount of annexation, just to show that they will, and it's only a matter of when they decide to do it, rather than not doing it at all. And I should remind the viewers that, in fact, when Netanyahu announced that he was intending to annex the Jordan Valley and the northern Dead Sea, Gantz said that was my idea in the first place. So we're not talking about there being that much difference between them. But I do detect, and here in the UK, in Europe, it's only in the American administration, really, that is behind this annexation plan of Israel. And of course, unusually, the American ambassador to Israel is on that committee that will decide where the lines are drawn, which is completely bizarre. And it shows you that even America is acting illegally by facilitating this annexation.
Thank you very much, Professor Kamel, Hawaash, analyst and commentator on Middle East affairs, joined us from Birmingham. With this, we come to the end of today's Newswire. We'll be back with you tomorrow at the same time. Till then, take good care.